Hello, my name is Devex, and I'm a senior reporter here at Devex, and I am joined today by Achim Steiner, who's the administrator of the UN Development Program. Achim, thank you so much for being with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So we have spoken quite a few times over the years about not only what UNDP is doing, but really about the development industry and how things are changing. We are in a time in the development industry, in the global economy, of incredible flux and uncertainty. And so I'm really looking forward to getting some of your thoughts and insights on where we sit today. And your term leading UNDP is ending soon. And so I want to also get your thoughts on sort of what that journey has been like leading UNDP, which has a presence in so many countries around the world and is really trying to work at the heart of so many development issues. So maybe let's turn first to sort of the state of things today. You know, the Trump administration came into office in January and proceeded to dismantle the bilateral U.S. aid and is undergoing this review of all of its relationships with international organizations. UNDP contracts that were funded by USAID, a lot of those have been canceled, is my understanding. You can tell us more about sort of what's ongoing and what's not. But what sort of impact has that had for UNDP, for the UN system? How much is that sort of shaking you to your core?
Well, I think the decisions by the US administration in themselves, serious as they are, and in fact there is close to 100 projects that have been affected by the either stop orders or terminations that have been issued, are not in the first instance, let's say, of a magnitude that changes fundamentally UNDP's portfolio, partly because the US government's financing of UNDP is limited. But I think what is absolutely critical is, first of all, to look at it through the lens of partners, because every project has a very particular context, it has a very particular group of people or an institution. For those partners, for those people, for those institutions, the termination or stop orders are a major problem. They, first of all, came out of nowhere. Secondly, they often have been partnerships that have been built over many years, whether it is, the work that we might be doing for HIV/AIDS and the supply of antiretrovirals, for example. I mean, these are life and death circumstances in a matter of perhaps 6 to 12 months. We also look at a lot of our work that we do, particularly in fragile and crisis contexts, where very often UNDP is part of a backbone of the international community to help stabilize countries at their worst moment in history, whether through a civil war or conflict within a country or with neighboring countries, or sometimes at the tail end of a natural disaster. Now, those projects that are terminated, again, clearly come at a very bad moment in time, because countries really do depend on external support to, first of all, respond, but also to stabilize. And then we have a series of programs that work on the rule of law, on good governance, on anti-corruption. Again, all these elements that allow a country to recover from crisis, from disaster. And when you stop that support, you essentially weaken the ability of those within those administrations to actually get out of crisis. The whole point of UNDP's engagement in so many crisis contexts around the world is to accelerate the transition from being a humanitarian situation and having a large humanitarian caseload to actually having development drive a country's consolidation, stabilization, ultimately economic recovery.
I guess, how are you then adapting to the current reality? What does UNDP need to do to change? Are you looking to other donors? Are you looking to change the model of how you're working? I know one of the things we talked about really early on, I think maybe 5-6 years ago, was that you were reorienting UNDP to work more with the private sector, that you saw sort of a real need to engage the private sector in this work. So do you lean more into that? What sort of happens now? How does this change things?
Well, here perhaps it's helpful to also acknowledge that basically we have seen over the last decade or decade and a half really a chronic erosion of the volume of finance in relative terms, but even in absolute terms, that has been available to development cooperation. While the OECD figures were still going up in recent years, went over the $200 billion mark, also post-COVID, if you actually unpack these figures a little bit, for much of the developing world, such as the African continent, it's either been a stagnant or even a declining amount of funding. To an organization like UNDP and to many multilateral institutions, in fact, the core funding, which often is the foundational financing that allows us to be present in countries across the globe, has also been declining. So we have faced already, if you want, a financial phenomenon that is equivalent to defunding international cooperation. Now, obviously, some of that was absorbed by projects, but if you look at the concentration, I mean, even UNDP's funding today, over 50% of our financial resources are actually spent in crisis countries. And we are a development program. And in fact, some of the greatest development challenges are not necessarily only in countries with a crisis or a natural disaster. It is the great transitions, energy transitions, poverty, inequality, pivoting into the digital age. That has already been constrained. So when I began my tenure as head of UNDP, I was also reflecting on the fact that the whole way in which we look at the financing for development is evolving, and the need and the rationale for investing in one another is greater than ever. And we can come back to that in a moment. But the institutions and the resource flows and the way we are financing that imperative to work together is actually going the other direction. So this asymmetry became a real preoccupation. Taking an institution like UNDP, which has this fantastic asset of being present in virtually all parts and countries of the world, as a foundation on which to build a future of us. So very much the narrative of UNDP in recent years has been the future of development. What is it that countries will need for themselves, first of all? And secondly, what does the world need as an infrastructure to be able to cooperate with it? So climate change, cybersecurity, the advent now of emerging technologies such as AI, or indeed just addressing some of the tensions that come when an economy grows fast, inequality grows, too many people are left behind. And finding ways in which the offer that UNDP could make to countries, first of all, is one that is bespoke and is really oriented around their priorities. But secondly, also reflects the imperatives on where we have to come together, because if we don't work together, we cannot tackle these big global threats to security, to human well-being.
Yeah. So on this issue of development cooperation, of working together to address these challenges, I think we're seeing a moment where this idea of multilateralism is really being tested and strained through a number of different issues, be it trade policy, and a lot of it has been driven by the United States and policy changes, but not exclusively. There's a lot of new actors and new players. And so I guess one of my questions is really, how do you envision the future of multilateral cooperation in a world where people seem to be turning more inward or more focused on what is good for my country rather than looking at the collective in ways that maybe we have in the past? And then specifically, what does that mean for the future of the UN and for UNDP?
Look, in history, we have often seen this phenomenon that when things get tough, when there is a great deal of uncertainty, when there is more tension internationally also, the reflex or the tendency to turn inwards is a very natural one. And this is not something new. But I think particularly in our time, in our age, in the 21st century, this simply is an irrational way of thinking about de-risking the future and including securing your own future, whether defined in a community or in a national context with national borders. And we live in an age where I believe firmly that this notion of human security, which has evolved alongside the Human Development Report narrative for many years, is a way of trying to contain a little bit that reflex, because retreating when some of the greatest threats to our own security, to our national security, lie outside our borders and not necessarily in the army of our neighboring state, but in the uncontrolled runaway climate change, in a cyber economy that will be driven by cyber crime and cyber terrorism, or indeed by a world that begins to migrate from one area to another simply because it can no longer cope. Those are threats that precisely point you in the direction of having to cooperate and to co-invest with one another. And that's why I go back to this moment in 2015, which to me was an enormously clarifying moment. And it wasn't an accident. The world, despite already a lot of tensions and differences, adopted a 2030 agenda, a sustainable development goal, set of 17 goals, in a way as a declaration of interdependence. not because we all want to depend on one another, but to recognize that our ability to solve problems is premised on being able to work together.
But do you think things are different today? I mean, the U.S. is saying that it doesn't want to follow the SDGs. They're saying that, we don't see climate as a big threat. We don't want to focus on climate. We don't want the institutions we support to focus on climate or to use our dollars to do that, is at least the sense we're getting. So it seems like we're maybe in a different moment than we were then. How does that impact
We are in
us?
a very different moment, and I was coming to that in the sense that I think domestic politics has become so polarized. So there is a lot of uncertainty. It is driving a great deal of tension and debate within our countries all over the world. And whenever you have that kind of mix, then polarization becomes a tool in politics, and weaponizing, for example, the outside world, your neighbor as the enemy, or the agenda of someone else as essentially the big problem, has sadly become a prevalent phenomenon in many countries. And we have seen particularly this idea of international cooperation being sometimes ridiculed with projects that are made to sound silly. And for most people, obviously, helping somebody who is far away is a more distant concept than asking yourself, what is happening to my school, my neighborhood, crime in my city? But the two problems are not solved by, in a sense, withdrawing from one. And I think this is where we have lost a great deal of confidence in our publics, that those relatively minor investments we make. Remember, the whole OECD world last year invested just 0.33% of gross national income in international cooperation. 0.33 to solve world poverty, to try and stop climate change, to make the world more secure, to get digital inclusion, to fight terrorism and extremism. I mean, it's a ridiculous sum of money if you look at it in those terms. But the way it is portrayed in many of our domestic debates is, oh, this is project money that is going to some community. We don't even know where this island is, and it's not being spent on us. And I think in that sense, we find ourselves in a very different space. First of all, the confidence that development works has been severely questioned and eroded. In my mind, sadly, very often for ideological reasons rather than for factual reasons. And we can maybe come back to that, because I actually would argue development has worked remarkably well if you look at it on a basis of investment and a rate of return. But right now, we also have another phenomenon. We now live in a world of 8 billion people. 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, a limited amount of ODA was a very significant proportion of the investment budget of a developing country. In today's world, it is a, let's say, very strategic and minimal injection of additional investment. It doesn't solve the world's problems in one go. And that's where multilateral institutions, also the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, are increasingly being judged also by, well, if you have all these problems and we've spent all this money on international cooperation, what's gone wrong? I mean, is it all a failure? And I think we have not engaged in that discussion in an open enough and also in a, let's say, self-critical enough manner.
So how do you do that? What is your recommendation to organizations like UNDP, to the UN as a whole, to the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, about how to be honest about what has worked, what hasn't? Because I do think that there will be more scrutiny on accountability, and frankly, with shrinking budgets, there has to be more focus on how this money is going to be used most effectively, right?
Well, let me put it this way. There are many in the aid bureaucracies around the world who are essentially homing in almost exclusively on a kind of accountant's narrative of development cooperation. Can you squeeze a little bit more out of here? How much are you spending on staff? How much are you spending on travel and so on? And look, any institution, any public institution, also UNDP, needs to be scrutinized, should be scrutinized, and needs to be accountable. The fact that we actually are in many ways one of the most transparent organizations on the planet is perhaps sometimes overlooked when we then home in on trying to solve world problems by asking ourselves, can UNDP be squeezed a bit more? I mean, we already spend 92 cents of every dollar on program. Can we make it 92.5 cents? That's not going to solve the great challenges of our time. So yes, let's make sure these institutions, first of all, don't waste money. And there are areas in which we waste. And let's also be honest, an institution, a family such as the UN system that has evolved over 8 decades, an architecture with always new institutions, new mandates, new programs being added on, is in urgent need of a decluttering, of a reconcentration on core functions. That kind of reform I would welcome wholeheartedly. But that then is a systemic reform. It looks at structural issues and does not try to do a sort of accountancy reform. The other part is, how do we finance the kind of development investments that are needed in the future? It's very easy for people to say, oh, it's trade and it's private sector investment. Yes, for some it works, but we are a world of 8 billion people, and let's take the energy sector. I mean, a phenomenal result of 20 years of understanding how we had to shift our energy systems last year resulted in, $2 trillion being invested in renewable energy infrastructure out of a total of 3 trillion. And it's a remarkable number. Talk about an energy revolution being underway. But when you then unpack it, less than 2% of those 2 trillion actually were invested on the continent of Africa, where the largest number of people without even access to electricity live now, today in 2025. So that is why we need to broaden that lens and the aperture and say, we can finance development with private sector financing and looking at trade, even though our trade system is also under assault at the moment. But it then needs complementary measures. This is always this balance between public and private sector, between the incentives. We need to find ways in which we de-risk for a certain period of time the kind of investments we want the private sector to focus on, and then we can actually reduce that again.
And the reality is that, this billion to trillions agenda, and that came out of, ADIS and the Financing for Development Conference, where 10 years later, we're about to have another Financing for Development conference in Sevilla in late June, early July. And really that promise of billions to trillions hasn't been realized. I think people are finally honest about that, right? That it hasn't worked. But at the same time, it seems there is a doubling down, especially in the current sort of financing climate, that the private sector has to be the future. And I think there are real questions, particularly for fragile countries, low-income countries, where, quite frankly, the private sector, especially the international private sector, is just not going to invest, right? So I'm curious how you sort of parse those two things, and as you sort of look ahead to Sevilla, how do you think some of these debates and dynamics are going to play out?
Well, first of all, I think in Sevilla we have a choice. We can either haggle over a chessboard where there's hardly anything left to haggle over, which is kind of ODA public finance. In the short term, there is simply a defunding and withdrawal by the OECD countries, and it's a fact. And we, I think, should critique it. We should call it out, because in the long term, it is a very short-sighted response to a particular moment in time. But nevertheless, a conference is, in a sense, a mirror image of where the world finds itself. The world at the moment finds itself in a situation where investing in one another has somehow lost the attraction. But I think Sevilla could also be a moment where we say, look, we're passing through a difficult moment. But actually, if you look over the next 10 to 20 years, these are the pathways in which we can actually find a world economy that can invest in energy transition, in the digital public infrastructure, in a global digital ecosystem. And these are the kinds of volumes of finance that are needed. And then we can also unpack a little bit, because let's take climate finance. How much time do we spend in the established groups at each COP negotiating over climate finance? The truth, and sometimes uncomfortable truth, on both the G77 side and the OECD side, is that major developing economies are not being funded by the OECD world to make these major energy transitions. China and India put together, almost 40% of the world's population, are not being funded by these climate funds in any significant way to trigger these extraordinary investments they have made in energy transitions, green infrastructure, including in India and China now, achieving rates of investment that are without parallel anywhere else in the world. So let's for a moment disaggregate and focus in on the poorer countries, small island developing nations, maybe crisis countries, where, as you say, that kind of financing is neither domestically viable nor will it come from the private capital markets. That's where we need to focus with public policy instruments, helping to de-risk grant elements, but also with hybrid finance models, and recognizing that it is actually in the interest of a 21st century economy that Africa, for example, rapidly gains access to electricity for all of its citizens, because that's the greatest single transformative driver in development. The market of Africa, with 1.5–2 billion people, is going to be a market of the 21st century. But if a third of that population is living in an age where there is no electricity, not only is it economically irrational, it's also politically very dangerous. And I think if we talk about Sevilla now, let's not lose sight of our common and shared interests, even though the climate for co-financing and public finance in ODA right now is probably at its lowest for 3 decades.
I think that, are there any sort of specific things that you'd really like to see come out of Sevilla, either, part of the, outcome document, or at least, meaty conversations around specific issues? Are there?
Well, at this stage, let me first of all acknowledge that actually a lot of member states are quite positive in terms of the draft document that is there. Now, there are two interpretations. It doesn't hurt anyone, therefore it is okay, or it's actually giving expression to a number of ideas, aspirations, and commitments that speak to the longer-term future of finance. I think I would tend to believe that it is the latter, and therefore I think Sevilla could be a good way in which the world essentially comes together and says, look, Houston, we have a problem. We need a lot of money to be able to get out of this economic crisis, finance crisis, climate crisis, but also growing inequality around the world. And that requires enormous levels and volumes of investment. It's quite clear, and everybody acknowledges it, that one part of the world is not going to finance another part of the world's development. But the way we can combine forces, there are many opportunities here. Let's be also very practical. I mean, a lot of the international financial markets are still very much regulated, guided, influenced by thinking, let's say, in a transatlantic context. But the reality of tomorrow's economic activity is shifting very rapidly. So sometimes this discussion about international financial architecture and governance sounds very abstract. But if you can't reconcile and ultimately align the economic reality with where financial institutions that were established 80 years ago are still operating on the same governance platform that was conceived in another age, and that, by the way, applies also to global security. I mean, look at the debates about the Security Council in the UN. We have to evolve this architecture because otherwise it becomes increasingly marginal, redundant, and ultimately not attractive to where the music is playing. And I think these are, in a sense, areas where if you and I sit in a cafe somewhere in the street and say, what on earth are they talking about, international financial architecture, it's very difficult to follow. But much more practical. Much of our work as UNDP, and this is during my tenure also in UNDP, I've put a lot of focus on financing for development, sustainable finance. A lot of that also has to do with tax systems. So we have a Tax for SDGs platform where we help countries to look at how they can evolve their taxation systems. We have a Tax Inspectors Without Borders platform together with the OECD. Sounds a very odd thing, but that by helping countries get tax expertise, they have been able to claw back over $2 billion in otherwise taxes that would not have been
And
paid.
that domestic resource mobilization has to be a key part of the future of financing these
Any
initiatives.
national sovereign nation that has pride in also the determination to shape its own development path needs public revenue, because this is sovereignty. You can take your own public revenue, invest it, with parliament and with your government in areas that you believe are fundamental to your development, not because of a neighbor or of a donor or an international financial institution. So we are working a lot on that. We have also worked in the UN with now 86 countries on these integrated national financing frameworks, precisely to broaden the lens. It's not just a state-led investment budget that will drive a country's economy. What are the private sector, domestic, international, and also concessional and global capital market opportunities that are there for a country in order to have a very deliberate investment strategy? So a lot of our work is not waiting for an international community to rethink its ODA strategy or logic. It's actually focused on countries having the sovereignty and independence and ability to generate their own investment economy.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that's one thing that has been kind of a shift at UNDP. I want to get you to reflect a little bit about how you've seen things change at the agency over your tenure. What are the things that you are sort of most proud of having sort of changed or put in place? Any specific regrets too?
Well, regrets are for a conversation perhaps offline, but I would say when Secretary Gutierrez invited me to lead UNDP It was at a moment where two or three things were happening. One, the UN system itself had to reform, had to rethink its focus, its orientation, its relevance, including how it would organize itself. So I came in at a moment which was, for UNDP, a very difficult moment, because that reform of the development system also involved very significant shifts in what, UNDP had become very much used to being, so to speak, the platform for the resident coordinators. The delinking was a difficult moment, but I actually saw it as a liberating moment, because, to be very frank, coordination is a vital asset, but it's actually also a very ungrateful task. And the UN Development Program was not set up as a UN Development Coordination Program. It was actually the UN's most central and, to this day, also vital offer to countries: how can we help you in your development? So transitioning an organization that was used to an infrastructure or an architecture into a far more, let's say, mission and offer and service-led view of its role was one of the challenges. The second one was, and there was no accident, as a former head of the United Nations Environment Program, to be invited to lead the United Nations Development Program was also, in a sense, bringing to a point of closure this view that environment and development were two separate spheres. UNDP today, I say with some pride and satisfaction, is a sustainable development organization. It is not an organization that pretends to be an environmental think tank, but it is an organization that has the ability, through its systems approach, through its complexity capabilities, to help a government do precisely what it has to do, which can't be Monday climate change, Tuesday health, and Wednesday education. It's how do we develop an economy with all these problems, in a sense, like Michel Yeoh would say, everything, everywhere, all at once. And I think that in part has been my focus also. How can UNDP be that partner to a country that has to make so many decisions every day and has not the luxury of having an ideal starting point? How do you deal with systems transformation, transitions, complexity, and how do you also focus on a 21st century interpretation of a public institution? I would say with some pride that I would defend UNDP today as not an anachronism. It's in its 60th year of existence. So we're not spending a lot of time celebrating 60 years as an anniversary. We're actually using our 60th anniversary to reaffirm that this institution belongs to the future, because, first of all, the world needs an architecture and a platform to cooperate, but it also needs an institution that is focused on the future of development, be it digital, be it AI, but be it also the issues of inequality, of budgets, of finance. That is the core of what I think UNDP can offer to countries.
Do you think that the future of UNDP is under threat at the moment?
In some ways, as much under threat as anything is when the world can no longer agree on whether it wants to retain something it spent 8 decades building up. I think the sometimes somewhat expedient debates that are happening right now about our international architecture do worry me. I mean, it's no accident that after one of the most tragic moments in human history in 1945, the world came together and said, let's not make the same mistakes again. Now, no institution, however wisely designed and built, will ever be nirvana. And I think one of the challenges we have is that in all these institutions, but also in the politics amongst the member states who govern these institutions, there is calcifications, there is new coalitions, there is also sometimes a conservatism and a risk aversion to actually change things that has rendered our institutions less effective and less agile than they should be. Now, the privilege of leading something like UNDP that is not in the political crosshairs, but is a very practical, operational, and grounded program. I mean, 95% of my staff work in the countries we serve. So our headquarters is not the big center of gravity. It is actually the proximity to countries. That's why I say our greatest assets are our people and our presence. And that, I think, has allowed UNDP to be far more agile, to adjust itself. I mean, you may recall early in my tenure, I launched something called the Accelerator Labs because I wanted to create within UNDP a constant challenge to also this assumption that an institution, by virtue of existence, brings already the wisdom that is needed. Much of the innovation, the ideas that are playing out today are actually germinating in the countries, in the communities, in the entrepreneurial sector. So those accelerator labs, which we launched simultaneously in 90 countries to change UNDP's lens on, first of all, understanding what was happening in the country, but also tracking new partnerships with the private sector, with universities, with entrepreneurs, with the innovators of an economy and a society, I think have transformed, let's say, the way we see our role also. So those are all drivers of what I would argue is a future smart institution.
But maybe you didn't quite answer the question of if you think that's completely under threat. Do you think there will be a future for UNDP?
Well, as I said, I mean, if you basically conduct this discussion as if there is no price to shutting down an entire system, yes, I think the institutions are under threat. I think the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, our commitments to one another on AIDS, on climate, on crisis and humanitarian responses. I mean, the tragedies that are playing out right now across the planet, first of all, in terms of the catastrophic level of conflict, the record numbers in refugees and displaced people, and at the same time, a collapse in humanitarian funding. And if people really saw what this means to literally millions of people today across the planet, that already would lead to a different debate. But, we are overloaded. We cannot absorb that anymore. So we shut down. And that's why then these discussions emerge about, should we get rid of the whole system? You will not realize until it's gone how much you actually benefit from having it, which is not to say that a catharsis, maybe a crisis, maybe a fundamental questioning of certain things is not overdue. But, to put it very simply, if you throw out the baby with the bathwater, you no longer have the bath, the water, or the baby. So, and that's the moment we're in. Do I personally think UNDP will, in a sense, disappear? No. I think we are far too relevant to too many countries, and the surveys show that, the aid in data surveys and so on. And I think also the fact that last year, even in that financially very constrained environment, 12 countries increased their core funding to UNDP, not significantly, and while others, cut their core funding. And we still have a volume of financing today where over a quarter of our funding actually comes from the developing countries, the program countries that engage UNDP. And that in part is also where I think UNDP's future financial foundations will increasingly lie.
Yeah. So as you sort of look ahead, because your term is coming to an end, I think one apt question is what's sort of next for you, but also what advice might you have to your successor, and what do you think that selection process will be like? I've heard some rumors. Traditionally, the head of UNDP is sort of a European, but some rumors that maybe the US would push for an American to lead the agency. So I'm curious about some of those dynamics, about sort of the race to succeed you, but also sort of where you're heading next.
Well, rumors are for you to find them and evaluate them, for me to simply observe them without comment. So I think, in the United Nations, I personally, and I think many would argue, no organization should ever be reserved for any particular country or region. It is more whether you have a diversity in the leadership of the UN and the different organizations that is probably the most determinant criterion. But the selection process is underway. The Secretary General has invited nations to nominate people. People can apply. And my hope is that the next leader of UNDP is a person who can give expression to both the middle value of having a multilateral platform which nations can literally cooperate and co-invest in development. We need it more than ever. And development is a fantastic narrative, if you want, of national interest coinciding with international or multilateral interests. Why would a country's ability to give its population access to electricity somehow be not in the interest of the rest of the world? I mean, somebody has to explain that to me, because sometimes I find myself in debates where development finance is almost portrayed as a sort of crime against a national interest. I've yet to come across any convincing example of that. We may have differences on policies and ideologies and so on. So somebody who I think understands the centrality of the unique mandate that UNDP has within the UN and in the international community. Secondly, somebody who understands deeply that the world of development is so far from where we were in the 1960s, 1980s, even around 2000, where development paradigms development paradigms and models were somewhat defined in certain centers of political and economic gravity around the world. Development is ultimately an expression of creativity, of freedom, and of opportunity. It has to be rooted in the society, in the country, in the communities we work with, and then we build upwards. And I think UNDP has to be led by somebody who understands that being the head of the UN Development Program is not about propagating a particular singular view of development. It is more about helping the world to come together. Shared interests, ultimately leading to mutually beneficial outcomes. And I think in that sense, whoever will take the lead very soon, I hope, is somebody who I think, first of all, inherits an organization with an extraordinary mandate. Secondly, an institution that is focused on the future of development. Yes, that is having a stressful moment in how to make this financially viable business model evolve, but is in high demand and I think enjoys great respect in the developing world in particular, and is a trusted partner. I mean, the greatest asset ultimately of UNDP is the trust that it has enjoyed and built up over many years. By not being a come and go, fly in, fly out organization, 90% of our staff in our country teams are nationals. We have often accompanied countries for 30, 40, 50 years. We're not a development project. We are actually a development promise.
Great. And so what's next for you then? Do you know yet?
Well, first of all, a little bit of decongestion and some travel and trying to sort of, leave one moment of my life behind. But I'm hoping in a few months' time to find a new way of engaging on particularly this issue of security and development. I think to me, we live in a moment in time where a concept that UNDP has been part of curating for decades now of human security related to the Human Development Report going back to Professor Amartya Sen, Mahbub ul Haq, but also very much in this moment where a world is willing to spend $2,400 billion on defense budgets last year and is actually cutting the $200 billion it invests in development. That contradiction needs interrogation. We are spending more on defense and are intending to spend even more when the net result is, if you were to just look at the state of the world, more wars, more crises, more refugees, more unsolved problems that are going to become even more of a security threat. So I think finding a way in which we can combine and align this notion of national security with a perhaps contemporary understanding of what is the nature of the great threats to national security, but also ultimately to human security. And is that the foundation perhaps for thinking about why we need one another when we think about decisions related to my school, my economy, my job, and they have a lot to do with somebody else's school, economy, education, and job. And more will be revealed in due course.
Well, we look forward to hearing what you come up with in that context as well. And just wanted to thank you for joining me today and for sharing your insights at this sort of really unique juncture in the future of development and in really thinking about what development will look like.
Thank you very much. Always been a privilege to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.